2 years ago, the number was in, when we were counting the studios, the number was in 200s, maybe 300s. I don't remember it off the top of my head. But the latest number, I think today, is 728. We just added a few more, I think, yesterday and today. But 724 studios qualify for that pretty strict definition of what the studio is that I had in the earlier slide. And that's as of, a few days ago, 728, I think now. And what's interesting is over half of them were launched in the last 5-6 years, right? And so you're seeing some kind of acceleration happening despite COVID. You would think that COVID would have dampened some of this, but despite COVID, there's some acceleration that's happening. And what's also interesting is if you look at the breakdown of the studio count per region, you see that it's not a North American story, as many things are in venture. This is, in fact, now there are more studios in Europe than in North America. And North America, by definition, is Mexico, US, and Canada. So Europe actually has surpassed. And I don't know if I have it. Yes, okay. So I think as of this week, this number is actually higher for Europe. And Asia and other regions are coming up, fast as well. Their clock speed is higher. So we do see still a very North America, Europe-centric model, but over time we expect that the distribution of the studios is going to be much more evened out over time. There is a lot of people think, including me, that the model is comparatively more advantageous in developing ecosystems and fragmented ecosystems. So Europe, as much as much of Europe is one market, still it's not as easy to do business, if you're a French startup to go launch in Germany as it would be to be a California startup to go launch in Nevada. So this kind of fragmentation ends up being a comparative advantage for the studio model, which is in the business of taking out friction where there is some in the ecosystem. This is going to be a crowd pleaser, I think, in the new white paper. We actually heat mapped the studios. Those 724, I think, are in this heat map. And when you look at it, it is interesting. You may have seen this on my LinkedIn profile. What's interesting is, of course, you expect Silicon Valley and New York to be hotspots, right? But LA is also there, which is nice. Maybe you would expect that as well. But then when you go to Europe, London and Paris and Amsterdam and Berlin are also hotspots there. And comparatively, you may not think that these hotspots would be as hot as they would be when compared to the US hotspots. And the only non-US and Western European hotspot is Singapore. And we're trying to make a dent in our realm, being based out of, Saudi in Riyadh and in Dubai in UAE. And what's interesting is these 8 hotspots, 8 cities, account for 40% of all the studios. So there is some concentration, as you would expect, I guess, but that is still, to me, a very eye-opening number, that 40% are still in these cities. And you would expect some of this because these are hotspots in venture. But I think the takeaway is maybe the spread is more even than what you expect if you were to look at venture capital or accelerators. So being a leading edge, a new innovation, the studios seem to be spread out more evenly across the planet than you may expect. These are some of the numbers. The world record per city is actually in New York. There are 66 studios in New York City. Quite amazing. I think some of it follows that early success of DataWorks. And London and Paris are head-to-head. I think Paris may have surpassed in the last few days, but they're head-to-head as well. And of course, Singapore is, a great show for Asia and non-Europe, non-North America market. What's interesting, of course, is, the discrepancy in funding. right? And I'll say a bit more about that, I guess, in the coming slides. But you know, still, yes, New York, you know, for 66 studios, you know, ends up having what, like about 8x, 7x the number of, you know, the volume of funding versus Paris, right? Less than 1.5 times, but much more in funding. So thus, US seems to keep its advantage in that, yes, there are venture structures in the US, but they are, you know, continue to be better funded than their European or Asian counterparts. This is an interesting map of Paris. Something interesting is going on over there. I think it says 50. I think we narrowed it down to about 46 active studios in Paris. And I think it's a, you know, nature of the culture. I think in France, I think there's something to be said about how people are willing to share a venture and its equity and the responsibility in building it. There's also, I think, some legal reasons why this is done this way. So if you're a successful founder having sold your company, I think putting it in a studio-like structure ends up being a benefit for taxes as well. But we're looking into this. It's a very interesting, you know, market to study and learn more about. We talked about some of these. I'll skip over them. A year ago, this is, if you're raising funding for your studio, this ends up being a good slide, an eye-opener, because a typical venture investor may be against the model or may not understand it immediately and maybe may have a knee-jerk reaction, reacting negatively. But then if you go and say that, you know, 5 studios raised over $1 billion a year ago, just in March alone, that usually makes them listen, right? And these are great success stories. These are friends of ours, be it, you know, Pioneer Square Labs and High Alpha, good friends of ours. And there's, of course, Atomic, and then Juxtapose raised a $300 million round, and Redesign Health came out of nowhere. I did not even have them on our map, and they raised $250 million to, as the name suggests, to redesign health and launch, you know, startups in healthcare sector. And so there's some good stories, right? I mean, there's, you know, lots of, you know, studios forming. They're, you know, interestingly being spread across multiple cities. Cities like Paris are showing a lot of studios and the success stories, and, like, you know, 5 studios raising $1 billion. Well, the tough thing though is, you know, we counted best that we could, and we counted about $21 billion in total funding for studios to date, right? That's from beginning of time till now. That's what we could count. The actual number is higher than this, I'm sure, because I'm sure we didn't find every funding story out there, but it's in the ballpark of $21 billion. That seems like a good number, especially when you factor in that this is the funding raised to the studio and not the studio ventures. So we have spun off a couple of ventures, and this number would not factor in the funding those ventures raised externally. It would only factor in what we raised as Enhance at the HQ to the studio level. So 21 billion sounds like a good number. However, just top 5 studios have raised more than half of that. So there's an incredible concentration of funding. And if you look at the top 20, it's over 3/4 of it, right? So it's not the you know, most encouraging story in that sense, that, you know, top 20% of the funded studios are getting about 80% of the funding. It's 80-20 rule, once again, holds true. But we do see that this is changing, right? Almost every studio that we know of is, you know, either just raised funding or is in the process of raising funding, and many will succeed because we are, as a collective, getting much more sophisticated in telling our story and communicating the advantages of the model. And the successes of, you know, some of these, you know, funded studios are getting the attention of large investors, be it LPs, be it, you know, super angels, or be it even VC funds. So the list keeps on growing. If you look at some of those, you know, well-funded studios here on the left, and the kind of funding that they've raised in millions of dollars, you know, here in this column. And then if you look at some of these investors, right, it's an impressive list.